The panel discussion on climate change and migration will be led by Head of the Secretariat of a Platform on Disaster Displacement, Atle Solberg.
Thank you very much to the organizers and to Oslo Pax for putting climate change and migration and displacement on the agenda. I'm very excited to be here today. And we also have a great panel that will teach us a little, or we will have a better understanding of what are some of the key challenges around climate change and displacement. And they will also help us to think about what could be some of the key messages we can bring to the climate summit. I would like to get started, so I would kindly ask my panelists to join me. Mathisen from the Changemaker, Grainne O'Hara from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and Francois Gemenne from the Hugo Observatory at the University of Liège. Please give them a warm applause. We have a slight change in program. We were supposed to have a keynote speak by Embla Regine Mathisen, who's the leader of Changemaker. She unfortunately fell ill and cannot join us. So we will have to do without the keynote speech. But I have asked our panelists, since we then will have a bit more time, and we also will be missing an introductory speech, that we spend some time on putting the issue into context. And I will start to just recap a little what we have heard today. I think we are coming, this panel, in a very good moment of time of this Oslo Pax, because already in the morning we have heard several examples how climate change and the adverse effect of climate change do play a role in the way people are moving and people are forced to move. We have already spoken about the hurricane Dorian that hit Bahamas over the weekend. And we heard that there were devastating impact on the island. We don't really know how many have been displaced yet, but we already know, for example, from Miami, that people are evacuated in the anticipation of the hurricane. So one aspect where climate change plays a role is how climate change are affecting extreme weather events, such as hurricane and tropical cyclones, and how these extreme weather events will increasingly displace people. Average estimation is that 26 million people are displaced in the context of sudden onset weather events and earthquakes every year. We have also heard that some of the more slow onset impacts of the adverse effect of climate change will affect how people are moving. We heard about sea level rise, desertification, glacial melting that will have an effect on livelihood. And we don't really know how many people have been moving or how many people are moving in the context of these more slow onset effects of climate change. We also know that slow onset events and processes such as sea level rise can easily combine with the sudden onset events. Think of the island of Tuvalu that the foreign minister spoke about this morning, the foreign minister of Norway. There's a low-lying atoll nation. It's already affected by coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion. And I don't think we need much imagination to think what would happen to an island like Tuvalu if it were to be hit by a tropical cyclone at the category of what we saw in Dorian in Bahamas. We also know that increasingly climate change do have an effect, or it can affect or even intensify conflicts. We heard that the link between climate change and conflict is uncertain, but there's clearly an impact on conflict situation by climate change, and we all know that conflicts do displace people. So these are some of the 4 scenarios we have heard about today. And what I would like our panelists to spend maybe in a first round of questions is to talk a little about what are the more specific knowledge? What do we know more about these dynamics where climate change and human mobility is involved? And how will this affect people? What is the human face of these processes? What are the specific needs of people? And we would also like to turn to responses, effective practices, and what we can do. Finally, I hope the panel can give us some clear ideas how we can, what will we like to communicate when Sophia is going to the United Nations Climate Summit? What should be the key messages coming out of this session? I also want to bring to your attention that we have Isaac from Nairobi also on the line, or together with us virtually. We will also bring him in to the panel at one moment. So I'm seeing Isaac on the screen here. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So in about 15 minutes, depending a little how long Grainne and Mari and Francois is talking, I would like to turn to you, Isaac. Is that okay? Thanks. He's waving to me. Mm-hmm. So get started. Francois, you're an academic. Yes, you're an academic. Can you help us a little to put this together? What do we know about climate change on one side and all the pathway and linkages to the mobility of people? What do you think we need to know more about? And can you give us a flavor of some projection? I wanted to bring to your attention, since you just joined us at midday, that the foreign minister talked about the World Bank groundswell report in the morning. So there are some scary numbers out there that we may want to prepare for. So Francois, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I like the idea that you turn over to an academic with the hope that he would bring some more clarity. I'm afraid this is a bit naive, but...
Yeah. I can also, there was another phrase being used this morning by Penelope, is that it's complicated to make it simple, but please make it simple.
Yeah, but it's complicated. I'll do my very best. Indeed, what we know from the different studies, and I guess it's fair to say that research on this topic of the connection between climate change and migration really started some 20 years ago in the early 2000s. And when we first started investigating this topic, initially, climate change and migration appeared as a very new topic. And soon enough, the people displaced as a result of the impacts of climate change became a sort of incarnation of the human impacts of climate change. They were being used, in many communications as a way to convince people that climate change was already happening and that the impacts of climate change had already materialized. And if people needed proof, if people needed concrete evidence that climate change was a reality already, they could turn to the people on small island states, they could turn to people displaced by floods, by hurricanes, or by drought. And therefore, I think that that's a kind of initial flow that we made as a research community, was perhaps to lock the figure of what we call then climate refugees, become some sort of a symbol of climate change, an incarnation of the human dimension of climate change. And then, as time went on, of course, research did make significant progress. And I think one of the most significant progress that research has made in the past few years was to try and untangle the categories. I think that in the minds of the public, there is still this perception that you have, on the one hand, the so-called political refugees who are being displaced as a result of conflicts or persecution. On the other hand, the so-called economic migrants who are looking for a better life, or better jobs, or better salaries. And then on the third hand, if I may say so, a new category would be the climate change migrants, people displaced as a result of the impacts of climate change. Yet, it doesn't work exactly like that. And this is where it becomes a bit complicated. Because the impacts of climate change do not directly displace people. Of course, in some extreme cases, like in the case of hurricanes, for example, people have to flee directly because of the hurricane. But in many, many cases, the impacts of climate change will actually weigh in on the other drivers of displacement, on the political drivers of displacement, on the economic drivers of displacement. Climate change will induce tensions for land in some places of the world. In other places of the world, climate change will compromise the livelihoods of people. which means that a lot of those whom we call political refugees or economic migrants are also moving in a way or another as a result of the impacts of climate change. Let me give you an example for this. At the moment in Europe, there are significant flocks of migrants coming from West Africa. And they come from Guinea, from Côte d'Ivoire, from Senegal. And when they arrive on the shore of Europe, European governments and public opinions call them economic migrants because they come from countries that are not at war. And therefore, it is assumed that they come to Europe in search of better opportunities and in search of a better life. Yet, when you look at their trajectory, at the migration route, you'll find that many of them come from rural areas and were sent by their families to cities and to towns because the families could no longer make a living out of agriculture as a result of rainfall variations, as a result of soil degradation. And then when they were in cities, sometimes they moved to the country next door and then to Niger, for example, or to Mali, and then some of them made it to Libya because they were caught in the net of smugglers and traffickers, and then at the end of the day, they arrived in Europe. So if you look at the different steps of the migration route, you will find that initially, they had to move out of the countryside, out of the rural area, because their family could no longer make a living out of agriculture. And in a way, it is a very Western bias to think that we can distinguish clearly the economic drivers of migration and the environmental drivers of migration. In many parts of the world, and certainly for the majority of humanity, the environment and the economy represents basically the same thing. When you see that in sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the population depend directly on agriculture as a primary source of income, and when we know that subsistence agriculture is extremely vulnerable to climate impacts, that means that every time there is an environmental change, it also induces an economic hardship for those people. And I think that this is one of the key progress that we've made in research, was to realize that the so-called climate change migrants were not a specific category distinct from other migration dynamics, but that climate change was a big factor weighing on the other drivers of migration. Another complication is the fact that people take their migration decision on the basis of a wide range of factors, which include, of course, the impacts of climate change, but which can also include, for example, their own perceptions of the impacts of climate change. And sometimes their perceptions of the changes are not the same as the observations of the change. And therefore, we need to take into account how people will perceive the change to understand how they make their own decision about migrating. And I think that, in a way, one of the difficulties of research is that the more we research into this, the more complicated it gets. And of course, the more complicated it gets to explain also to general audience and to policymakers. And I think this is a key challenge for research at the moment. Now, you've asked me about projections and about how many people we can expect to become migrants in the years to come. The difficulty of this and of these projections is that very often you don't have any idea of whether you're talking about cumulative numbers or about a certain number of people displaced at a certain moment in time. For example, when UNHCR puts every year the annual statistics of the number of people forcibly displaced in the world, the statistic is about the stock of people displaced. That is, at the end of the year 2018, some 68 million, if I don't say a lunatic figure, some 60 million people were displaced at that moment worldwide. When we make projections, what we don't know, whether we say 100 million, 250 million, or 300 million, what we don't know is whether we're talking about accumulative numbers or about a specific number of people displaced at a certain point in time. At the moment, we have very little clue about the duration of the displacement and about when people are able to return. And clearly, I think that's one of the key dimensions of climate change, is that in many parts of the world, return will be impossible. And I think that is a key difference with other types of forced displacement. when there is a war or political persecution, you can still hope that at some point peace will come, or the dictator will be overthrown and people will be able to return home, even though we have a lot of protracted situation of displacement. With climate change, in many cases, and I dare to say in most cases, return will be impossible, and we're talking about permanent displacement, which means that we will need to think together about how to relocate significant numbers of people. And clearly, when we see the state of the debate, at least in Europe, on migration and asylum, when we see the political crisis that every rescue boat in the Mediterranean induces amongst European governments, clearly we are not at all ready for a debate about a vast program of relocation of people who live in dangerous places and who will be permanently displaced in the future. The difficulty is to know when.
That's very good. Thank you so much. Maybe an applause for... So you say it's complicated, and we have to get out of that. It's complicated, and I will challenge you in the next round. So what are your specific policy proposal? How can we start to address this at the international level? I think you brought a very important aspect, which is some process might be irreversible. There might not be a durable solution for the displaced, which is return. So we have to think creatively that there will be people that cannot live in parts of the world where they're living today, and that presents some major challenges. Thank you, Francois. Now I want to turn over to Grainne, and Grainne, she told me this morning that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they have been twice awarded the Peace Prize. So clearly, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees do have an important role to play in this conference and also in this area. We all know that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, you do play an important role. You are working on the ground. But we also know that you are primarily mandated to work with those or assist and protect those that flee persecution and conflict. And what I would like you to tell us a little about what is your thinking within the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as an organization on how to deal with some of the challenges that Francois spelled out, but also how you work in nexus situations. We heard this morning there is this distinction between disaster, climate change, and conflict. They sometimes collapse in front of our eyes. So please, Grainne.
Thank you very much, Atle, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us. I have to say that Oslo is a place, and Norway is a place where we feel very much at home as UNHCR, not just because we are the proud winners twice of the Nobel Prize, not me personally, the institution that I'm representing here today, but also because of Mr. Nansen and the history that Norway has with the issue of forced displacement. So it's a pleasure for us to be here today. Atle, you will be pleased to hear my team prepared a speech for me, but I'm not going to read that speech. But I have learned from participation in a lot of these conference events, that if you don't have a speech and if it's not on the website, sometimes it's almost like you were never there. So the speech I will leave for the website. I'm glad to see that we're also being webcast, so everything we're saying also becomes a bit more interactive. And I'll move immediately to the question you ask us, and I'll pick up, I hope, with the same kind of enthusiasm that we heard from some of the panelists earlier on, because I was particularly invigorated when I heard General Mood say that, you know, people say humanitarians don't do climate change, and he said, well, I have a lesson for you, they do every day. And people, and in particular sometimes member states, would like to think that UNHCR does not do climate change because there's somehow some bizarre firewall between the impacts of climate change and the work that we do and are mandated to do around forced displacement. So let me say that UNHCR does do climate change. We deal with it day in, day out. And there's three basic areas of interface, I think, that describe the extent of the work that UNHCR as an institution does with climate change. First of all, and you mentioned it in framing the question, there's the whole issue of nexus. Now, nexus is a very popular word around the UN these days. We have the nexus between peace and development. We have the nexus between peace and security and development. Well, UNHCR has its own nexus, and for us, one of the motivating factors and what we feel legitimizes our work around the question of climate change is the nexus between the impact of climate change, as has been described very eloquently by the previous speaker, as part of a multi-layered complexity where you look at climate, you look at poverty, you look at conflict. So we have a nexus, which is the nexus between the impact of these multi-layered effects that drive forcible displacement and the nexus to the 1951 Convention. And under what circumstances of analysis you can look at the complexity of all these factors that drive forced displacement. And I'm very deliberately saying forced displacement. I know we're working under a working title that says migration, but I'm deliberately using the term forced displacement because there is, I think, a distinction between being forced to move and migration, which tends to suggest some kind of option. And that's not always the case in the dynamics we're speaking about. So I'm using that term deliberately. So we have that nexus with the 1951 Convention where we as UNHCR say, if all these factors line up, and they are linked with a persecutory ground under the 1951 Convention. So we're not saying that climate change persecutes people. We're saying that in the complexity of all the different factors, if you link that with one of the 1951 grounds, which is race, nationality, religion, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group, you will have the right to international protection as a refugee. And we believe that more and more this applies to situations in which climate change is a fundamental feature. Second area where we have a job to do as UNHCR, the environmental impact of large-scale displacement. In the photographic exhibit that was displayed on screen to introduce this panel, you saw some pretty shocking pictures from Dadaab, which is one of the largest refugee concentrations on the globe. This picture particularly of the razor wire protecting the food distribution. We believe as UNHCR, and we know it from our direct operational experience, that we also have a role to play vis-a-vis the environmental impact of large-scale displacement. If you put a lot of refugees or IDPs packed together in a place like Dadaab, and there are many places like it on the globe, you deny people freedom of movement, you deny them in displacement the possibility of a dignified life through use of their own labor, then you end up with an environmental impact which is like a double impact, because these camps have a massive environmental impact. Immediate deforestation, I'm going to stumble now on this word, immediate disappearance of all trees, because in most of these locations they're depending on charcoal as the main fuel, depletion of water sources, so the fact of displacement itself can now further fuel environmental impact, which causes further displacement. And third, and I will stop here in the interest of spreading the word across the panel and making your life a bit easier as moderator. A third area where we feel we have a role to play is the whole question of how the continuation of climate change and environmental degradation undermines the prospects of solutions, as we say in our lingo, you use the term durable solutions, undermines the possibility of primarily voluntary repatriation for refugees and for internally displaced persons. What I'm talking about here is situations that have been mentioned by several of the previous speakers. So you've got your protracted conflict, which remains unresolved, but I'm thinking even of another layer of climate-related impact. Because what I learned working in Syria and Iraq, which had never occurred to me before, when people are displaced for a long period of time, and agricultural land is abandoned. In some parts of the globe, that's a good thing, as we heard from our colleague from Amnesty International in the opening. Some parts of the globe, if land is abandoned and doesn't have human beings working it all the time, it will replenish. In some parts of the world where land is abandoned, it will go further and more quickly to desertification. So what I learned to my shock working in Syria and Iraq is that many of the farms previously worked by people who are now displaced are rapidly turning into desert. So even if the conflict is resolved, there's environmental and ongoing climatic impacts that will prevent people from ever being able to recover the livelihoods they had before. And I found that a very sobering thought, and it is the third, and I'll stop there, area where we feel UNHCR has a role to play across the very broad portfolio of climate change and environmental degradation.
Thank you, Grainne. That was very encouraging. We also get questions through Twitter, if I understand correctly. And we already got one to UNHCR, and it's from Emma, 26 in London. And she asks, is there something the United Nations and the UNHCR is not doing that you think you should be doing regarding climate change and conflict?
Good question.
Can we maybe let you ponder that?
Ponder on it.
And then we do a round.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would like to turn to Mari. And thank you so much for stepping in on such a short notice. That's very nice of you. And I just wanted to present Mari. She's former deputy leader of Changemaker, but she currently works for the Norwegian Church Aid. But today she will represent Changemaker, and she's stepping in or replacing Embla that couldn't join us. So just I wanted to clarify that. And Mari, I think I would be very excited to learn about the campaign you Changemaker launched in June, and I was part of some of the meetings. And if you could tell us a little, what is the campaign all about? What do you try to achieve? And what has been some of the experience of launching the campaign on climate change and displacement so far? So the word is yours.
Yeah, I will be pleased to present it to you all. First of all, Changemaker, most of you, I guess, do not actually know our organization. It's a youth organization that works with development politics, and we work to make the world a better place, basically. And so our job is to bring the science and the UN and everything that we've heard now into a language that youth can understand and that can engage youth. And on second hand, that youth can bring their new knowledge and their new ideas and solutions to politicians, so that we can actually change the system that is not functioning, the system that is creating inequality. So we do that through campaigning. And our campaign on climate migration or climate-induced displacement is called Climate Passiveness, klimapassivitet. Please Google it. And it's a campaign where we look at the problems of climate change. And we see that climate change is inherently unjust. It's a problem that's created mostly by rich people, and is mostly affecting poor people and the most vulnerable people. And we see that climate-induced or climate-displaced people are the ones who are actually the most affected. And so we try to maybe take some of the knowledge, the science that you've brought, and translate it into policy. And first of all, to deal with this, in our perspective as Changemaker, we feel that Norway has to step up their game. So all countries have to contribute to reducing climate gas emissions. And Norway's fair share of emission reductions is actually 430% by 2030. which is absurd. It's impossible to actually reduce more than 100%. So that's why we say that Norway has to reduce at least 53% of Norway's emissions within 2030. And in addition to that, Norway has to reduce emissions in other parts of the world and to work with climate adaptation and loss and damage through climate financing. So Changemaker is demanding that Norway gives 65 billion kroners in climate financing every year to contribute their part to tackling climate change. So that's part of the solution, because if we want to reduce the stress factors for climate migrants and hopefully make sure that people can actually stay where they want to stay, at home, and also help the people who have to migrate, we have to reduce emissions and we have to adapt communities so that they can handle climate change. And then thirdly, because we're not going to be able to stop all emissions, and we are already seeing the impacts of climate change. People are already being displaced. We wanted to find a solution that could really tackle the human rights issues and security issues of the people who are displaced. And we're speaking about people who are internally displaced, but also people who are displaced across borders. And if you're a climate migrant or a climate displaced person and you cross a border, suddenly you don't have any rights anymore. Because nation states are the ones who are obliged to provide you with your human rights, make sure that you're safe, make sure that you're well. But once you're outside of your own country and you're not recognized as a refugee, then you don't have any institution or body that can actually provide you with these rights, make sure that you are safe and secure and have water, shelter, for instance. And so we wanted to tackle this problem, and we are suggesting a climate passport based on the Nansen passport. I don't know if you've heard about the Nansen passport, but after the war, there were a lot of people who were displaced in Europe, and they didn't have any place to go. And so a Nansen passport was created in the name of Fridtjof Nansen, and people were allowed to go to safe havens, to countries where there was not war, where people could live safely and be provided with security, with protection and their basic human needs and rights. And we want to see if this is possible to create again for climate migrants, climate displaced people, because we know that there are a lot of people who are already fleeing their countries, and in the future there will be even more people, and if we don't have an international system that can support these people and help them, our society, or the global society, will have failed these people.
Thank you. Can I? I think the comprehensive approach you're recommending about focusing on climate action, focusing on resilience, adaptation, and then deal with the consequences if we cannot mitigate, I think that's a very good policy recommendation. Can you tell us a little how the reaction to the campaign has been, and probably primarily around the climate passport? What has been some of the feedback and the reaction to that idea?
So we launched the campaign in June on our camp, basically, for the members of Changemaker, where you were as well. And so far, there hasn't been so much reaction to the demand for climate passports. But we've seen with the school strikes for climate that there are more and more people supporting our demands to reduce emissions and to give climate financing, which is amazing. Even the government is almost getting there now. And so we're really happy about that if they actually go through. But the suggestion or the solution to have a climate passport hasn't really reached that far yet. We know that there are parties also in the government who are supportive of such a solution. The left party, Venstre, has suggested to have a similar solution. That then they said that climate migrants should be able to come to Norway. But then there are other parties in the government who say no to all migrants at the moment. So it's a really difficult. It's a really difficult demand, and especially right now in the migration crisis that's happening at the moment, European countries are really afraid of migrants, and it's difficult to go through with this plan. But for us, we have to come up with a global solution that will actually help people, and so we can't just give the small answers. We have to look at the systemic issues, and the systemic issue is that climate migrants do not have their rights supported.
And you have just started. It's not a short project. It takes some time. So I would like later maybe Francois and Grainne to reflect a little on the opportunities and maybe also the limitation of such an idea. There are governments that are seriously talking about humanitarian visa, temporary protection system, so it's not an idea that only sits with Changemaker. There are governments that are willing to entertain different mechanisms. So I think it's a promising avenue to explore. I want to now get back to Isak, or not get back to you. You have been waiting. I think I promised to bring you in after 15 minutes, and I failed around 10 minutes late. But Isak, you are the chairman of the Mathisen Environmental Conservation Group, MECYG. And I understand that you do some excellent work on the ground, and also for people that may have moved in due to the impact of climate change in the rural communities. So could maybe you tell us a little what you are doing specifically on the ground, and how the people you are working with have been affected by the adverse effect of climate change. So over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll go straight to my points. And I think we should not conflate migrants, asylum seekers, and IDPs. Each category is distinct. Just as we must understand youth and elder persons have different needs. The majority of forced migration today is to cities. Internal displacement is an increasingly urban phenomenon. Displacement also increasingly takes place within cities, whether the result of urban conflict, disaster, or infrastructure and urban renewal projects. This year, Global Report on International Displacement 2019 focuses on the urbanization of internal displacement, but climate change scenarios were not applied to the model, just as the evidence increasingly points towards the accelerating vector of existing issues that climate change represents. Migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, and returnees now predominantly seek safety, access to service, and livelihood in urban areas rather than camps. Often, this means reduced access to economic and educational opportunities. When economic and educational opportunities are limited or non-existent, violence and exploitation rise, with youth and women most affected. We need meaningful participation of youth, especially women and girls, to combat resulting inequalities. This must include bottom-up solutions to climate change and job creation to help prevent the resolved social tensions that may otherwise lead to conflict. UN Habitat job creation program in urban waste management and other labor-intensive and thus high job creation programs are proven tools to this end. There exists a climate change trafficking in person nexus 2, to which youth, especially in vulnerable climate changes, will strip population of their assets and options, forcing them into precarious and exploitative labor conditions and rendering them overall vulnerable to third parties willing to prey on them. The importance of engaging for youth to solve the issues they face cannot be understated. My own story is that I went back to my community to help youth stay out of crime, to offer them alternative and to protect them from police and other state actors who further marginalize my community. The psychological impact of displacement is also significant. The upheaval of moving may be destabilizing, and the struggle to survive is unfamiliar surrounding. Often alone adds to people's stress. Domestic violence may increase among families who move as a unit, and indigenous people may also face additional trauma because of discrimination and detachment from their ancestral lands. Children and youth participation are marked for life, but such psychological trauma, which is cumulative. Climate change induced displacement will worsen existing challenges associated with IDP populations and human migration more generally, and accelerate the rate of displacement. Rapid urbanization always been difficult to manage and resulted into urban sprawl, tensions between and which communities and reduce opportunities for all involved. If youth is not adequately integrated in combating this dynamic, everyone involved loses out. If we want to highlight the potential, creativity, and energy youth can bring to their communities, we must also highlight the policies that restrict them to achieve their potential. In sudden onset contexts, such as when major earthquakes occur, displacement brings the disruption and normal life and livelihood and heightened protection concerns for people with specific needs and rendered homeless, such as women, children, older people, and people with disabilities. UN Habitat's one-stop youth centers are part of the answers to engage the impact of climate change on human migration and internal displacement. They serve as incubators for youths to be trained and supported to create solutions their communities and themselves face. Migration itself, independent and asylum seekers, is mostly inter-regional and should be supported as it allows for adoption, labor market efficiency gains, and well as remittances. Lowering remittance fees is a key policy to support individuals and their social work adapting and building resilience to climate change, which also providing economic redistribution and gains. It is often young men in regional such as SSA that are sent to send remittance. We need to engage with this dynamic and enable them to provide safety nets for their families back home. Children, older people, and those with disabilities are among the groups worst affected by displacement. Education opportunities may be better in urban areas, but the struggle to meet families, increased living costs, and basic needs may result in children being taken out of education in order to work. Many new arrivals also suffer deteriorating health in the form of new conditions or the worsening of existing ones. As a result of changes in climate, inadequate shelter, overwork, poor working condition, stress and reduced nutrition, this makes it possible for criminal groups to activate, recruit youth facing a lack of option, active exploitation, or mere survival. As with education, health and care facilities may be better in urban areas, but economic hardship put them out of reach for any displacement persons.
Isaac? Can you hear me, Isaac?
Yes, I can hear you.
This is Atle. We have exactly 10 minutes left now, and we wanted to have a round from all the panelists. So if I kindly ask you to conclude your intervention, would that be okay?
Yeah. Okay. So, in Guatemala, research showed internal displacement leading to few improvement in people's lives. This is not a general truth, but the result of policy failures. One exception, however, is when new arrivals have skills which allow them to access employment opportunities in urban centers and when available in rural areas. This, in turn, may also improve their access to education and healthcare services. Some people, such as members of LGBT communities, may find greater acceptance in urban areas, or at least that they are more able to social integrate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great. I think we heard so much about some of the impacts of displacement. We also heard some good thinking around how to address some of these challenges. So thank you so much for that. We have 10 minutes left. So I would like us now to turn a little focus towards the climate summit. Tomorrow we will, if I understand correctly, present some key messages that will be handed over to the United Nations Secretary General. So Francois, I know it's complicated, but can you please give us some ideas about how can we do better in terms of policy and institution and money and the way we are working?
I think one general principle as to how we can do better is, I think at least from a perspective of Western countries, that Western countries need to do more than their share. I'd like to take the example of the country I'm from, Belgium. That's a tiny little insignificant country of about 11 million inhabitants. This country represents 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is already quite a lot, when you think that we're only 11 million. And a lot of the discussion right now on climate policies in Belgium is we should do our share and reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, you have people telling, well, you know, Belgium is only 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emission. What difference will it make? And I'm struck by the fact that Belgium is an incredibly wealthy country, and the priority seems to reduce the domestic emissions so that Belgium is on track of the Paris Agreement. And I'd like to tell them, Belgium needs to do more than that. I mean, when you're a rich Western country, you cannot think that your climate policy is limited to your national boundary. Not only do you need to commit adaptation funding to try to limit the impacts of climate change in other countries, but you also need to think about what you can do as a rich country to help other countries, emerging countries and developing countries in particular, to also reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. Because if all Western countries do only their share, and even that they're not doing at the moment, but if they were to do only their share, that will not be enough. And I think that we need to regain some sense of international cooperation and what each country can do beyond its own borders. And that's the difficulty at the moment, because public opinions are not yet ready for that.
Thank you so much. In the area of international migration management, and I would like you to comment a little on the climate passport. Do you see any specific proposal you think should be carried forward? I'm talking about those moving across international borders.
I think that the Global Compact on Migration, which was adopted last year, represents a very significant step in the right direction. It recognizes climate change as a migration driver, it encourages international cooperation, and I think that on paper, it looks very good and very promising. The problem at the moment is that countries are so reluctant to discuss about migration in international fora and to discuss about the global governance or international cooperation on migration, because they see it as a fundamental part of the national sovereignty, and they feel that they would abandon or relinquish their national sovereignty if they were to participate in global mechanisms of better regulation and organization of migration. And yet, that's the thing with climate change and migration. The better you will organize these flows in advance, the better chances you have to maximize the benefits of migration for the migrants themselves, but also for the host communities and for the origin communities. And countries like to wait until the very last moment, so that they're in a crisis situation that will only fuel extremism and nationalism and xenophobia. And they fray about international cooperation. I think we need to convince governments that the better they will anticipate and the more they will cooperate on these issues, the best it will be for everyone, including for their own interests.
Thank you so much, Francois. Grainne, there is a question here which is very similar to one of the one I wanted to ask you. So I read this one from Mira, 31 years of age, from Oslo. It says, to Grainne, do you think a climate passport is something that can actually be implemented? Can it be done? And then I also would like you, we have 7 minutes left, to think a little, think loud about some messages for the climate summit.
Okay. So many things have been said. There's so many things to react to, but I try to be disciplined, Atle. To Mira, and I haven't forgot about Emma. You asked me a question earlier. Emma in the UK is still waiting for an answer. So on the question of the climate passport, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything that has just been said by Francois. For states, the act of crossing an international border is potentially one of the most sensitive, defining features of their sovereignty. At the same time, international refugee law is premised on the fact that there are legitimate exemptions or exceptions to state sovereignty when it comes to the need of protection. So I would say about the campaign, I would say, you know, be bold. Try to push for new ideas, but as you do so, be aware of what's already existing and use to the maximum the tools that already exist. The Nansen passport is very dear to us in UNHCR because it has its natural successor in the 1951 Convention travel document. If you look at the 1951 Convention and its schedule, you will see there the evolution of what was originally Nansen's idea. And if you look, as was mentioned by Francois, at the two compacts that were endorsed by the General Assembly, because there are two, there is one on safe, orderly, and predictable migration, and there is one on refugees. And there you will see a lot of scope for looking at, okay, what are the avenues for what we, in our UNHCR jargon, all of us institutions have our own jargon, we call complementary pathways or safe passage routes. So there's a lot out there. There's a lot of tools already existing. You will get pushback. You will be told that because of sovereignty issues, there can never be such a thing that will allow for free movement of people around the globe. And yet, if we look regionally, There already are in existence some similar like regional arrangements for free movement. ECOWAS has it in West Africa. The CARICOM is trying to develop something similar in the Caribbean. Within the European Union, we all have our European Union passport, and it gives us free movement. So, you know, things that people felt were impossible maybe in the past because of political or legal restrictions, they can be possible. I would just say to the campaign and around this idea, use to the maximum what already exists. Because I think that's the way to build on positive policy outcomes. A quick reflection on something that was said earlier and even in earlier sessions about the whole question of terminology and the question of projections. Now, two words you will never hear out of my mouth, although I'm just about to say them, is climate refugee. It makes no sense in the realm of international refugee law to talk about a climate refugee. You don't become a refugee because of the impact of climate change. You become a refugee because of the combination of a number of factors which underlines a persecution in terms of the 1951 Convention, which gives you then a legitimate right to international protection. I have a bit of an aversion. I mean, I realize why, you know, it's a catchy phrase and it's used a lot in the media, and I understand why, but I also think it can be kind of weaponized in a negative way. And because we're dealing in a world that is so polarized around human mobility, when you stick together terms like climate refugee with projections of tens of millions, this evokes in the minds of some policymakers the idea that, oh, well, if that's the case, there's too many, let's shut everything down. So I think in terms of language and influencing policy, we have to be careful about how we describe things, and we have to leverage where there's already openings. Saying that should not limit in any way the bold nature of the ideas that the youth delegates are going to take to the summit in New York. Suggestions for the summit. My boss will be there, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, will be there. Any of you who are attending, approach him, lobby him. You will find that he has big ears for listening to all of these issues around climate change. He has got his own Global Youth Advisory Committee coming out of a High Commissioner's dialogue of 2-3 years ago. So he also has a commitment to raising the voice of youth, and I think maybe there is some scope where we could see how youth voices around the climate change agenda could be matched up with the voices of refugees and IDPs, who could bring, I think, an added dimension to this discussion, as our young friend from Nairobi just did with his very eloquent explanation of how the dynamics of displacement work. And the dynamics of displacement work towards, first, urbanization, second, most people that are displaced by the ongoing impact of climate change as part of bigger dynamics, their first step is not to wake up one morning and go, I think I'll go to Belgium or Ireland or Norway. You know, first it's urbanization, then it's countries, so it's the home state that bears the most burden, then it's countries in the immediate region, and we have to really dispel this notion, which I think is sometimes paralyzing to positive policy development, that there's this huge number of people just waiting to descend upon the westernized world, which is not actually what reality and operational observation shows us, which is not to say we should diminish the fact that there are going to be more people on the move, but we have to be careful about how we frame things and how we make our argument to bring more people on board. And in answer to Emma, who's been waiting a long time, these are the things I think that the UN needs to be doing more of. It needs to be pushing more the positive policy agenda. And I would just say, and then I will promise I will stop there, that when we talk about what the UN could and should be doing, you'll see a lot of good practice and you'll hear a lot of positive things coming out of some of the UN agencies. because we're proud of the work we do, whether it's UNHCR, whether it's Habitat, we heard a bit of their work. But then there's the part of the UN that's the political part of the UN that is the member states themselves. And this is, I think, where we have to have the push, moving into the Secretary General Summit in New York and moving beyond that to the Conference of State Parties in Chile, where we will have another opportunity to really push strong advocacy messages with the states that make up the UN.
Thank you. So maybe Sophia, right? You are carrying the message, could meet with the High Commissioner Grainne and we could set up the meeting already now. That would be something concrete. I understand I have 5 more minutes. I hope my understanding is correct. 3 more minutes. So, Mari, you have 90 seconds. Give us some fresh ideas on how to go to New York.
Well, this is difficult. What we want to get out of the climate summit in New York is to see all the countries committing to new targets that are actually in line with the 1.5 degree target, because the Paris Agreement goals are not. So that's the first step, and that's why they have the summit, so that countries will actually commit, and then they have to come home and actually do the action and cut emissions. In addition, we want Norway and all other rich countries who are capable of giving finance, we want them to give more climate finance, because there's definitely not enough climate financing for mitigation, but definitely not for adaptation at the moment. And under adaptation and loss and damage is also climate-induced displacement. So if we are going to be able to work with or against climate-induced displacement, or to handle climate-induced displacement in a better way, we need more action on loss and damage, and that's what they're going to discuss in December. So it's really, really interesting, and it's really important that we actually get some movement there. I want Guterres to not let the parties leave before they commit to more, actually. Keep them over there in New York.
Excellent. And Isaac, you will have the final words. You also have a 90-second. Would that be okay? I'm sorry we are running out of time.
Yeah, that's okay with me. So I forgot to talk about what we do in my organization. So I'll talk briefly about it. So in my organization, we try to look at the challenges that are affecting our community, and the issue of insecurity, the issue of waste management, and also the issue of unemployment is a big problem. So we try to look at the challenges that are affecting our community, and by looking at them, we turn them into opportunities. And one of them is like collecting waste and taking it to a collection point where it's away from the community. So by doing that, we end up like creating job amongst ourselves, and also reducing the crime rate, and making sure that our environment is good and it's clean, and also young people are getting opportunities out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Excellent. Congratulations for the great work you're doing. I think my job is then coming to an end. We will have working sessions on climate change and migration. I think we got a lot of good ideas, some fresh ideas, some advice from this panel. So let's bring those conclusions and observation into the working group. And let's formulate some good messages that Sophie will bring to or take to New York in September. So a big applause to the entire panel, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.